So my name is Sean Tenner. As you may have noticed, I am not Avy Meyers, but Avy Meyers was a close friend of mine, and I felt that his work bringing information about judicial candidates, judicial elections, and activities and issues important in the Jewish community and in Chicago at large deserved to be remembered. I knew Avy for about 5 years. I was on his show many times. Many of my clients and friends and people active in the political universe in Chicago and Cook County were on Avy's show. And it was with great sadness that I heard about his passing last Memorial Day. At his gravesite, Avy's brothers and I were discussing a way to memorialize him. And I could think of no better way than by convening a final episode of Jewish Chicago. We are not in Avy Meyers' house. I know that Avy's house became a legend and a place that politicians from across Illinois would come to throughout the years. And we're doing this particular episode from the Standard Club in downtown Chicago. We wanted to have a wide range of guests who could speak to the various issues that Avy always tried to bring forward in his program. So that's the context for our show today. We're going to be talking about issues that Avy cared about. So sitting next to me is Rabbi Abraham Cooper. Rabbi Cooper is the Associate Dean of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, a global anti-hate organization which was named in honor of history's most acclaimed Nazi hunter, Simon Wiesenthal. I've worked with Rabbi Cooper for many years. He came to us from Los Angeles, came all this way because he felt so passionately about taking a stand in the 3rd Congressional District and saying that despite calls to just ignore this Art Jones situation, that history's shown that ignoring a problem does not make it go away. It's an honor to have him here, and thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me on this memorial program.
An honor. We have Alderman Michele Smith. Alderman Smith has done a tremendous amount of work in the Chicago City Council to combat anti-Semitism, to combat the BDS movement, and to make sure that the Chicago government is doing everything it can to address hate crimes and issues of discrimination against all Chicago residents. We also have Joel Chupack. Joel is a very successful and well-known attorney who is the president of the Decalogue Society of Lawyers. The Decalogue Society of Lawyers is the largest Jewish bar association in the United States, and Joel played an instrumental role in founding their anti-Semitism committee. Joel is also a candidate for the 12th Judicial Sub-Circuit, and pleased that he came to join us. We also have Alison Pure-Slovin. Alison is the Midwest director of the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Alison and I have made many trips together to Springfield, to the City Council, to the Cook County Board, spreading the message of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, spreading the message of tolerance and inclusion in our state. So we're going to start with Rabbi Cooper. Rabbi, tell us why you're in town today.
You know, back in 1977, Rabbi Marvin Heyer, my mentor, my boss and friend, went to Vienna and went to see Simon Wiesenthal in his office, the great Nazi hunter, and said, you know, King Solomon says a good name is more precious than oil. I'm here to take your name. And he said, Mr. Wiesenthal said, not so fast. I know if you're going to have my name, you'll go after the old Nazis, but I'm an activist. So if you want my name, I expect you to also be activists. And when it happens, not if, there'll be new Nazis, I expect you to be in the front line of those efforts. Now, with this local candidate, we might say the silver lining about this bigot is he pretty much hates everyone. He's consistent, not much nuance, but if you're a person of color, if you're gay, if you're Latino, if you're a Jew, the man is a hater and a bigot. And in the climate that we all find ourselves, we have a broken, really political discourse in this country. And the fact that the leadership of that party was asleep at the wheel that allowed him to actually get the Republican designation. So we know he's not going to win. And I've met with Congressman Lipinski. He's a fine gentleman and a serious legislator. So the point is, it was asked today at the press conference, why not just ignore him? Part of it, social media. They say all politics is local, but in the era we live, everything local is also global. So the impact across the United States, and by the way, beyond, in Europe where you have neo-Nazi parties, the notion that there would be this kind of a candidate on the ballot on the first Tuesday in November, it has to be challenged. And I found today I was very humbled and reassured by the tremendous bipartisanship across the board, standing united against, if you will, the ultimate kind of bigotry. And I hope it'll serve as a marker, not just for Chicagoland, but across the country, that even while our politicians, some of them in the room today, we're still slugging it out on the real issues, which is fine. That's what democracy is all about. We have to sort of rediscover the middle, set some bars and standards. And one last point, which I didn't anticipate in advance of this event, the Nazis in the 1930s introduced a concept called, actually for the Middle Ages already, animalization. They depicted Jews in Germany in the 30s as being less than human, rats, vermin, in the propaganda films. In the 40s, they mass murdered 6 million Jews. You had in Rwanda, you had one tribe calling another cockroaches. Next thing we know, there are 700,000 people murdered in a low-tech mass murder. Louis Farrakhan called me and every other Jew a termite this week. Sure, he thought it was quite clever. And as you probably know, Twitter has so far refused to remove that statement. But he's just following a certain kind of path. So this is the greatest country in the world, freedom of speech, words have consequence. And I just think that my trip to Chicago today was a great learning experience for me, reassured me about the amazing potential of America. And hopefully we'll be able to come back, as they say, for happier occasions.
Absolutely. Well, one of the reasons that today's press conference was important, in my view, is that this is not the first time modern Nazis have reared their ugly heads in Chicagoland. Those of us that were following politics in the 1980s know that the American Nazi Party chose Skokie, Illinois, the town with the largest percentage of Holocaust survivors in the nation,
yes,
perhaps in the world. They targeted Skokie and their community of Holocaust survivors to march. It was actually a seminal event in that many people who got involved in Jewish political leadership in Chicago came out of that movement. I believe Mayor Emanuel got his political start in that movement. Many people that became household names got started by fighting back against hate in Skokie.
By the way, many Holocaust survivors who till then were silent because of the pain,
right,
stepped forward. One of them, Robert Clary, famous LeBeau from Hogan's Heroes. Nobody knew he was even a survivor. He had numbers on his arm. And he stepped up and said, I'm mad as hell. I'm not going to let them deny the suffering of my family, their martyrdom. And I think that was repeated in thousands of households around the United States. So Chicago is an impact player, and that was a seminal event, not just for the city, but for the nation.
Correct. Now, Joel, you grew up in Skokie, in the Skokie-Lincolnwood area, at the time that the Nazis had threatened that community. Can you tell us what that was like? How did that impact you?
Well, I am a child of a Holocaust survivor myself. My mother was orphaned during the Holocaust. She lost both her parents and her closest brother. And she was one of these people who did not speak about it and kept it undercover. And when the Nazis came, my mother was very meek, 5'2", very, very quiet. But she was ready to go out there with my uncle, who also survived. and teach them a lesson. And the American Nazi Party did win the right to march there, but they didn't march there because they knew what was going to happen if they did. So it was very personal. I grew up amongst a lot of children of survivors, and I think it instilled in all of us a certain feeling that no, you can never stand by and let anything like this happen.
Alderman Smith, I know that we've talked about a lot of national issues, both in our press conference earlier and on this program, but what has the Chicago City Council done to address the rise in anti-Semitism, the rise in hate crimes, the rise in hate speech, and these incidents of bullying, often motivated by anti-Semitic canards that we've seen in local schools?
Yes.
What have you been involved in, and what do we need to do to support your efforts?
Well, the events of 2016, as we know, led to a real uptick in hate speech and indeed hate crimes in the nation and here in Chicago. City Council responded in November of 2016 by calling on the Chicago police and calling on the whole administration of the city to address these issues in a resolution. And it targeted the resolution was written to protect immigrants, Muslims, anti-racism, and it was interesting, even in that heated time, anti-Semitism wasn't specifically included. And I think that was an innocent oversight, but it's an oversight that can never be taken. It can never be allowed. So we changed the resolution, and I think the city is very united against fighting any forms of discrimination and hate. And that became really obvious when the Loop Synagogue was vandalized in January of 2017. You know, the Loop Synagogue has been here since 1959, and nothing had ever happened. But now, in the 21st century, it had its windows broken and Nazi symbols placed on it. Well, I would say the whole city came together, including City Council, to have an interfaith service there to protest it. One of the things that the Chicago police do in order to protect us is they are very aware of the location of Jewish institutions in Chicago, and they have received training on being concerned about these institutions. Most Jewish institutions, as many people know, unfortunately hire off-duty Chicago police just to protect the building, particularly during services. So this is an awareness that no one is 100% safe, even in a wonderfully diverse town like Chicago. And we know that we've had hate crime incidents here in the area. There's one under investigation right now there was a murder in Rogers Park just a few weeks ago of a black-hatted Jewish kid and someone else, and people are very much examining whether that's a hate crime. So I think what we need to do is to be vigilant, support the police who are supporting us, and make sure that our city doesn't inadvertently do anything to support the hate movement. That's why we've resolved on a couple of occasions to divest any investments in organizations that support boycotts of Israel or countries that really aid in hurting Israel as well.
Thank you.
Rabbi. I just wanted to add one more thought to this, which is we should be reassured that our political leadership sensitive to these issues, but we also need to be realistic that you can't legislate hate out of existence. Other democracies have anti-hate laws up the wazoo, and they don't come anywhere near to the level of protection that you have and freedoms that you have here. And the other point, which was raised in a number of ways at the press conference, is the fact that we now live in the social media world. And that means that whoever is so inclined has an incredibly powerful marketing tool 24/7, pretty much unencumbered. And that means that the level of vigilance can't just be the police and our elected officials, it's got to be the home, it's got to be the teachers, and ultimately it's got to be the kids.
So, Alison,
Actually, I'd like to interject, if I may, on the points that you were making in terms of,
I was going to ask you if you could describe the incident that occurred at Ogden School.
Absolutely.
And what
Yes.
the Simon Wiesenthal Center is doing to
thank you. So
address.
part of that's what I was going to address was it's the lack of education. And even though we say that we have to teach about the Holocaust and slavery, et cetera, lack of education is a lot what's creating what's going on. And I think it's almost 3 or 4 years ago now when Ogden School was doing their which is in the Gold Coast of Chicago, for those who don't know, and they were doing their lessons on the Holocaust. There was one Jewish student in the 8th grade class during this time, and 3 young men from the class created an online game in a game land called Clash of the Titans, and they created a game called Burn the Jews. And when the mother of the Jewish student appropriately went to the mothers of the 3 young men, the mothers, to tell them what was going on, to get them to remove it before involving the school, the children who created the games, the mother said boys will be boys. That was they weren't at all upset about it. And then, of course, the mother of the Jewish student went to the school, and the school actually did not know how to respond appropriately, and that's why it was blown out of, unfortunately, and came to the media, and we got involved. Because it was a teachable moment. And if you're teaching Holocaust education and the lessons that they're coming from that is how do you create a game about killing, it's obviously a problem. And in addition to that, as we talk about the uptick in anti-Semitism, et cetera, you know, on college campuses, and Rabbi Cooper can address this well, we're seeing more anti-Semitism right now than we're seeing in anti-Zionism. I think that every day his office is we're being told of swastikas, et cetera, and students are getting taxed. I had a student from University of Illinois, Champaign, call me last week that he's been receiving tweets on his feed from other students who are saying that Hitler should have finished you and that you belong in an oven, and pictures of ovens. And you know, when we talk about education, I really think that that has a lot to do with it. And we keep saying that this is a very diverse city, and it is. But the problem is it's also a very segregated city. And we can have as many laws as we want on the books, but until we bring communities together, which is what Simon Wiesenthal Center is trying to do, bring faith leaders together, because when we can, excuse the expression, break bread together and understand each other and bring the leadership together to say we won't allow it for anybody, because if an African American person is being hurt, then I'm being hurt, and vice versa, or LGBTQ. It's everybody's rights, but we live in our pockets and we don't try to help the other. And that's what the Simon Wiesenthal Center is trying to do in terms of our tolerance education, is to bring communities together so we understand that our what makes us the same.
Thank you. Joel.
Yes, if I may add to that, 5 years ago when I became president of the Decalogue Society of Lawyers, we established a committee against anti-Semitism. Who would have thought that 80 years after it was formed, there would be a need for it? But the first thing that we did was build bridges with the Muslim Bar Association, the Arab American Bar Association, held a joint break fast because Ramadan was coinciding with Jewish holidays. And we've continued that outreach over the years, because as minorities, we only really have the power if we're able to be well organized and work with other groups.
Thank you. Rabbi, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. Today, coming in from Los Angeles, you met a number of Chicago's leading elected officials, from Chairman Ed Burke, who's the longest serving member of the Chicago City Council, to some new legislators and new aldermen who are just arriving on the scene. Did you have any discussions or insight from all your conversations with these Chicago elected officials that you'll take back with you to Los Angeles? What will you remember about this trip to Chicago?
To be perfectly candid, when we were driving to the venue and going through a neighborhood that is lacking in so many just fundamentals of what a neighborhood is supposed to be like.
This was the back of the yards neighborhood in Chicago.
7-Eleven, a food store, just a park. It was pretty devastating. And so seeing the cross-section of Chicagoland, political Chicagoland. And Burke is history, of living history. And then you have a 23-year-old...
brought you a book about Nazi hunting, if I recall.
He did, and he also made a phenomenal quote, from Martin Luther King Jr. I learned a lot today. I thought it was a very humbling experience. I hope people in Chicagoland also sort of learn or relearn a basic lesson, which is, people in other zip codes can enhance your safety, your values, your life, if you make an effort to reach out. I just thought we had the best of America, in a sense, on display. Nobody making promises they couldn't keep, but a sense of solidarity and, frankly, some outrage that they had to be there for this situation. And to me, that kindles a sense of hope and potential. The potential is there. I think I mentioned it also at the press conference. The famous comment from Churchill, democracy is the worst form of government, except for every other form of government. But it's also an empowerment that every voter and every vote counts. If you sit back and wait for some bad things to happen, they will. But it's a contact sport. That's what Chicago's always taught the rest of the country. But nonetheless, there are, those core values that I thought really shone forth today, and the fact that it took place within a community that so many others, including myself, just assume, Yiddish term is Nebuch. Oh, it's really... The energies that we saw, the insights that we heard, from within the community were, to me, quite astounding and a good teaching moment.
Well, I know you had a good rapport with Kevin Bailey, who is a new committeeman representing the 20th Ward. I'm the committeeman for the 46th Ward, which includes the uptown neighborhood of Chicago, which is very diverse and has some similar challenges in a way. And that is one relationship that I think will be fantastic for the Wiesenthal Center to continue, is to work with different groups throughout the 3rd Congressional District to make sure, well, frankly, to make sure that we don't have to have another press conference 2 years from now about a Nazi being the major party nominee.
Right, but here's what I see as a youngster, a young person, who had to deal with the fact that apparently it happens quite often, that there was a really needless killing this morning between 2 workers, and the struggle, being with people of faith in a Christian mission, where everything about these institutions, about the value of a life, and then what the people in these areas have to deal with, the reality of the valuelessness of life to so many who, whatever reason, will just pick up that gun and shoot. So a young person who's having to deal with the reality of murder on the streets of his district every day, and yet seeing someone with light, sense of hope, and is ready to commit his life, for his community. It's quite astounding.
Well, I thought the bipartisan unity that we had today, which the spirit that you helped bring to Chicago, was truly outstanding. Reverend Mitchell Johnson, who's here at the Standard Club with us, spoke about how it was Everett Dirksen, a Republican senator from Illinois, who really helped push the Civil Rights Act of 1964 across the finish line. That bill could not pass with just Democratic votes or Republican votes. And David McSweeney, Republican state representative, who lives and actually was a congressional nominee himself, and he knows you need 600 signatures. The Republican Party, no offense to my Republican friends, should have found a way to get somebody else on the ballot. And it was Republican State Representative McSweeney who I thought gave a really eloquent set of remarks today.
And he actually called in front of the media for everybody to vote for a Democratic congressman.
Absolutely.
Incredible moment.
It absolutely was. So I'm proud to now be joined by my colleague on the advisory board of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Chicago, Reverend Mitchell Johnson.
My pleasure to be here, Sean. Thank you so much.
And Reverend, you were recently in Toronto, Canada, visiting the Mobile Tolerance Museum that the Simon Wiesenthal Center has created. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I could, but I'd like to begin by saying Baruch Hashem, only because I'm here for Rabbi Cooper. And indeed, in the Mobile Tolerance Museum in Toronto, we learned several different things. Probably the most important thing we learned was this. There's a saying that if Muhammad can't get to the mountain, then bring the mountain to Muhammad. To that extent, the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Chicago visited the Mobile Tolerance Museum in Toronto. Here are some of the things we learned. That it is probably the most popular museum in the area of Toronto. In fact, the children in the first group were so excited about what they learned, not just about the Holocaust, but a modern American, indeed world history mobile tolerance museum that they told other students, and they were more excited on what they were anticipating to see. Indeed, we learned two things we probably didn't know. Number one, the focus of the Simon Wiesenthal Center is not just to teach about the Holocaust, but about intolerance worldwide. For example, I'm sure my colleagues and I, and Sean and I, we spoke about this, didn't know about the analogy of the rabbit-proof fence in Australia and Canada's own challenge with indigenous, let's call them Native North Americans. Indeed, there are efforts to educate and sophisticate this group by taking away their...
Educate should be in quotation marks.
Have mercy. I like that part, because it's not education. It's in fact an intolerance of another people group's way of life, and suggesting that changing them to a different way is the better way. And we've learned the problems of that. The second thing we all learned was just how little about the Holocaust the North American continent chooses to remember. And herein lies the problem, and that's one of the reasons why we had the press conference on today. We learned this truism that Rabbi Cooper and I think Representative McSweeney parroted from Martin Luther King Jr. Here is what it was. The issue is not so much the loudness of our enemies. The problem is the complicit silence of our friends. So even here, if we have atrocities such as we have in Maryland at Towson University, where Jewish students were chased and harassed for no reason other than their faith walk. If we're quiet, those of us in the Christian community, then we allow ourselves to be the next victim on the plate. The Mobile Tolerance Museum in Toronto was a wonderful tool that teaches children, among other things, their own history. At the end of the day, all of us have a history that comes out of a really dark place. But the best thing to do, such that we don't repeat it, is to teach it to our children, that they might not mimic it, and live in a world absent of as much hate as we can eradicate.
Thank you for your role in bringing faith leaders to the press conference today. That was a truly remarkable achievement. This is, as Rabbi Cooper said, an underserved area of Chicago. This is not an area where a lot of television cameras come to report what's going on. But this afternoon, I feel it was the epicenter of Chicago's political and public policy universe. Everybody was talking about the 20th Ward, about the 3rd Congressional District,
Yes.
about the issues that we're here to discuss. And your work doing outreach to the faith community and bringing them to the table was an integral part of that. So thank you.
My pleasure. And I'd like to opine, if I could, on the Simon Wiesenthal Center's commitment to encouraging faith community members around the country from doing a couple of different things, all primarily to get back to their own faith walk. So we have programs that encourage African American clergy, one, to visit the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles, the Museum of Tolerance. And the reason is we even have an immigrant community church group as part of our membership. And some of them are here in the States from Nigeria in general, and from the southern portion of the country in particular, where we have today Christians being persecuted because of their faith walk. Hey,
People are literally being crucified.
in fact, not just in Nigeria, but also in
6,000.
Syria. In the Simon Wiesenthal Center's Advisory Council, some of our colleagues are from Syria, and they're Christians in Iraq, and they're being not just persecuted. In Nigeria, they burn pastors alive in their churches in front of their parishioners. In Iraq, they actually crucify pastors. And those things are happening right now. And unfortunately, Alderman, they're not making the Western news. They're not making the New York Times or
horrifying.
the Chicago Sun-Times.
6,000 women and children just 1 month ago in Nigeria were killed and buried in mass graves for being Christian.
Recently, Baruch Hashem,
Bless God. Baruch Hashem, bless God.
Baruch Hashem, bless God. There is a Muslim extremist group that kidnapped a large number of girls.
Yes.
They were young girls. But all of the girls were released.
Boko Haram.
Pardon me?
Boko Haram.
Boko Haram, thank you. All of the girls were released except the one Christian girl. And she was murdered just this past week, merely because she was a Christian. So here's the challenge, Sean. We are members of the advisory council because we believe that if we stand silently by while people who espouse a Jewish faith walk are persecuted, then there's no hope for African Americans. There's no hope for Nigerians, for Igbos. There is no hope for any other faith group if the Friends are the most quiet. So we have a lot of work to do. But here, there is some good news. Here's the good news. In the 3rd Congressional District, not just the faith community, but communities of concerned citizens. In fact, I dare say in Chicago, there will not be another TV camera wherein you'll find representatives from the Republican Party, from old and new school Democratic Party, the faith community.
Diversity within the Democratic Party.
There truly is.
Both sides of the spectrum were sure there at the podium.
They were there at the podium. I'm talking about bald heads, twisted heads, red heads, a couple of blondes in the room as well, and some brunettes. All of them focus exclusively and singularly on this message, that we will not be silent in the face of anti-Semitism. We will not be silent when the voices of fascism and racism are screaming from the hilltops, elect me. We will push back, whether it's in Washington or in the 3rd Congressional District of Illinois. This is the land of Lincoln. This is the land where Republicans used to espouse one vote for every person and slaves shall be free. In fact, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by a land of Lincoln, that will be Illinois for those of you who don't know, elected official.
I think it's on the license plates.
I think it might be.
Both of them.
At the end of the day, we will not sit silently by while any one group is singled out, and we will stand up and utilize our voices and our votes to ensure that our representatives, both near and far, represent what is best in America, which comes from Illinois.
Alderman Smith, in hearing the Reverend speak, one thing that I found compelling about today is that we took a very dark subject, an avowed Nazi, an avowed racist, an avowed anti-Semite as the major party nominee for an important congressional seat. And we didn't just dwell on the bad. We brought people together. We had a spirit of unity. I feel like collectively we lifted Chicago up. And I feel that was the same spirit that I saw of people coming together to help the family of Commander Bauer. And I know you were involved in that effort. And I'd like our listeners to learn a little bit about what the family did, what community members did, and what Chicagoans did to help honor his memory, and most importantly, help ensure that this doesn't happen again, making sure the police officers have the literal protection on their bodies that they need.
First of all, I think that these two examples from very, very different events demonstrate that in tough times, Chicagoans will come together to support the right thing. We can put our petty differences aside when people are really at risk.
Right.
And people were really at risk in the 3rd Congressional District right now. They are truly at risk.
There may be 30,000 people, Republicans of goodwill, who go to vote, and if not for this educational work, accidentally may have voted for a Nazi.
That's absolutely right. And I think
That's why we can't blow this thing off and say, oh, don't give him any attention.
That's right. And I think that's also been inspiring so many of the activities that you've seen on the streets of the country since 2016, that people uniting to really reject hate, to be in favor of fellowship and tolerance, no matter how different we really are. Now, at the same time, we also cherish the people who protect us. And when Commander Bauer was really brutally murdered, the whole community came together, everything from literally tying blue ribbons around the trees of our neighborhood to bringing the police and their families food while everybody was staying up all night, to candlelight vigils that were interfaith at the station, and then importantly to the work of the Chicago Police Memorial Foundation. And I want to thank all the people who are sponsoring this program. We know that this foundation was very, very near and dear to Avy Meyers' heart, and this show is, I believe, dedicated to the Chicago Police Memorial Foundation. For those of you who don't know, the Memorial Foundation is actually the largest organization that supports police officers who are injured or killed in the line of duty, and they support their families, and they raise money so the kids can get therapy or whatever, or household help, or go to college.
It's a huge issue for police officers. There have been Chicago police officers who have taken their own lives.
Yes.
Just recently because of the incredible stress that's involved in that work.
That's correct. And so the Memorial Foundation not only seeks to help the grieving families and families that need support, but to help police officers today. And an anomaly of the law in many parts of Illinois is that police officers in Illinois purchase their own uniforms, their own service revolvers, and their own bulletproof vests. I think that all these events, for all of our divisions that we have in our city, and there are many divisions, I do believe that most people are committed to trying to pull together. We often just have to ask them. And I think that what you did today is that you asked people of Chicago to come together and reject it. And Avy Meyer always was a kind of a guy who was very concerned about making sure that the Jewish community, of which I'm a part, is protected, and the police who protect our citizens every day in the city under very difficult circumstances in a very changing time, they need our support.
And I learned a lot about the Jewish faith from my interaction with Avy. I'm Unitarian. I grew up Unitarian, but he taught me so much about the commonality between the two religions, and that was a really important thing. Avy and I did not agree on everything. No two people agree on everything. I was perhaps a bit further to the left than he was on some issues, but really opened my mind. It opened, I think, the minds of a lot of Chicago elected officials and aspiring elected officials to the Jewish community and issues important to that community.
Well, and I just want to compliment you for all the things that you do. The interfaith community is very strong in Chicago.
Yes, it is.
The Parliament of the World's Religions was held here, I think, in shortly after the Columbian Exposition. It was the first time that many people had seen people of certain faiths that did not really exist very much in the United States. And I think one of the key parts of the Simon Wiesenthal Center is tolerance for whoever you are, just as Alison said, and that's why it's such an important organization to support here in Chicago. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to conclude by giving Joel Chupack an opportunity to talk about something that Avy was really one of the only folks in the city focusing on, and that's the importance of the judiciary. We're all involved in politics and public policy to a certain extent here in our panel. But I'll admit, as a longtime political junkie, when I went to vote in my earlier days, I never knew who to vote for judge. I knew the major races, and then when I got down there, boy, like everybody else, I looked to see if there was a name I recognized or a funny name. Sometimes people make their middle names something amusing to get people to vote for them. It wasn't really until I started working on these races professionally I understood how truly important the judiciary is, and it seems to me it's more important than ever. Avy and his show really exposed a lot of Chicagoans to the importance of the judiciary, and he didn't just focus on Jewish judges. He invited judges from all backgrounds and all parts of the county and other members of the law enforcement community, left, right, and center to talk. So I would like to hear your point of view about the importance of the judiciary now in 2018, especially given some of the issues that we've been talking about on the panel.
Thank you, Sean. Well, Avy was obviously ahead of his time in thinking about judicial elections. most countries in this world, you do not elect judges. In many states, you do not elect judges. We're actually very fortunate in Illinois where we have a system where some judges are appointed and some are elected. Judges have a profound impact on people's lives, and sometimes a lot more direct than a state legislator or senator.
You'll see a judge before you'll see your state senator.
Well,
most likely.
the vast majority of the people will come in contact with the judicial system at one time or another. A judge could affect the status of a person, the status of their property. It can make financial decisions that could severely affect somebody for a short time or their life. So it is really important to do your research on judges, and there are lots of resources out there. The Chicago Bar Association has ratings, a rating system. Also, the what's called the Alliance, which is the Illinois State Bar Association, along with many other ethnic and minority bar associations. They have it, and there's other resources as well. The Chicago Tribune. But I would like to mention, oftentimes when I've been canvassing, I will hear people say, well, my vote isn't really going to count, and it will count. Voting, it has a cumulative effect. You don't think twice about maybe donating $10 to a charity. Your $10 isn't going to cure cancer, but it's the cumulative effect of all those people putting the money together to find a cure. And you've got to look at voting the same way. Your vote is important because you're voting with everybody else, and if enough people are voting for a particular candidate or for a particular reason, your vote does count.
Well, thank you for that. And I just want to close what is the last episode of Jewish Chicago by saying this is not the last time that people will get together and focus on the issues that Avi cared about. We've covered a lot of ground today, and we need to continue doing this work within different faith communities, bringing Republicans, Independents, and Democrats together to talk about issues of tolerance, to talk about public safety, and to talk about the intersection of these issues in Chicago. We have our challenges, but I think we saw today the best of Chicago. I hope folks around the world watch this show and learn a little bit more about what we're all about, and we'll look forward to bringing this group together again.
May I appropriately say, as we would say in Hebrew, to Avi, Zichron Levracha, may your memory be a blessing.
Yes.
Thank you.
Amen.
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 All right.
Thank you.